Hi everybody, my name is Nicholas Feldman, and today I'm going to be demonstrating an instructional strategy that I would use in the classroom. So first we're going to talk about what instructional strategy I would use, then we'll get to the demonstration with the instructional activity, and finally we'll just briefly go over what would happen after the instructional activity. So let's get started. The instructional strategies that I'm going to be demonstrating are a flipped classroom and collaborative learning. A flipped classroom basically takes the activities that you normally do in the classroom and has them completed usually on the learning management system or outside the class. This would be doing any of the required readings, watching online videos, reading from the textbook as part of the required readings. And that way, the classroom is reserved for assignments, tasks, projects, or labs. The other strategy is collaborative learning. In this case, students learn from each other. It's a peer-to-peer learning strategy. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate with the instructional activity today. So for the instructional activity, I've chosen student presentations. The presentations will be about a historical argument that centers on the origins of the Cold War. The class that I would be teaching in this hypothetical scenario is about the Cold War, and this would be the very first topic that we would cover. So for the presentation, students will have a choice. They can present individually or as a group. Now you might think that the individual part of it would negate the collaborative learning, but what will happen is during the presentation, students will still be learning from each other. That fits both the flipped classroom and collaborative learning strategies. So students would have a choice, and a lot of this would take place before the class even started. As far as students will know going in that they will have this choice, and for individual presenters, they will have wanted to do a little research beforehand. For everybody in the class, they will have had a chance to do the required readings, and that will include two study guides. One study guide, and we'll go over this once we get into the activity more, would be for sources, primary, secondary sources, and their genres. And then the other study guide would actually show students where to look in both their textbook and an additional resource for these historic arguments about the origins of the Cold War. So during these presentations, students will produce a one-sentence summary, and then they will explain why they summarized the historical argument that way. They will also produce two key events that relate to this historical argument. They will have one source that they come up with on their own outside of the textbook or additional resource. In the case of the individual presenters, they will probably have two to three sources, but they just need to tell us about one source, and we will also have a question. Each group or individual presenter will come up with a question for the class. So as as I introduce the instructional activity to the class, I would have these instructions on the whiteboard and we'd go over them. It would just talk about that they need to write the one sentence summary and the two key events, and what they're going to do is write them on the whiteboard before the presentation. Then I'll tell them that they need to explain why they summarized the historic argument the way they did and why they listed those two events. We also talk about finding a source that discusses this historical argument, and basically all they need to do during the presentation is say whether it's a primary source, secondary source, and classify its genre. And then we'll talk about creating the question for the class. I will explain why, because it's going to be actually on a formative assessment or on a quiz that takes place after the class is over that will be posted to the learning management system. So the instructions would be on the whiteboard as they work in a group. And then basically this is the point where we would get started. Now, I would assign the groups randomly, so that way people aren't picking groups, people aren't left out. Assign the groups randomly, break them down in the groups. The individual presenters, they can do their work from their desk or on their own. The groups would get together. And as they work, I would provide guidance, going around the room, helping any groups that might need little tips or advice. And then as the groups and the individual presenters start writing their one sentence summary and their two key events on the board, that would show me who needs help, who needs assistance, whether it's time management or maybe assistance finding that source that they need to talk about or a little clarification. Basically, an instructor, it would be important for them to provide this guidance and assistance during this preparation. And so the groups would start to get their presentations together. We'd have the summaries and the events written on the whiteboard. Um, and just make sure it fit into the time management as far as how much class time we have to do make sure there's time for presentations. And then once everybody's ready, it'd be time for the presentation. So everybody, but first we'd start with the groups. They'd go up, explain their summary, give the class their summary, explain their summary. Then the next they would tell us their two key events, why they chose those events. Then they just got to tell us about the source, so the primary, secondary, and what genre it is. And that would be it. And then we'd go group to group, and then the individuals would present. Now, after the instructional activity, I talked about the formative assessment already. The students would give us the students would give me the questions before they went up, and then afterwards, after the class, they'd be posted. I would put it together, maybe add a couple questions, and then the students would, and I would ask the students to give me questions that could be answered with one or two sentences, and I'd use that to see how much, um, what the students learned, to see if we needed to do any reteaching of any of the content. And another thing before that, even though, would be the closure activity. And what that would be is basically, I would erase where the instructions on the whiteboard were and start to make a list of those key events, synthesizing all the events together. So we have one long list of key events that connect to the origins of the core, and that's how we wrap up the class. So thank you for listening to my demonstration.